Hello and welcome to Maximum Depeche Mode, the first talking book about the band. It was written and researched by Ben Graham, music is by Amanda Thompson, and it's read by Luke Williams. You can check out our full catalogue on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk.
We was doing that in 1981, or what they're doing now, just basically not sampling, but using electronic instruments, drum machines and all this sort of thing. So we knew that was the way of the future.
To see Depeche Mode on their notorious Devotional tour in 1993 to 94, you would never have recognised the clean-cut lads who emerged from Basildon with the naive teen pop of Dreaming of Me in 1981. They'd begun as an antidote to rock music, a modern electronic pop group who believed that the guitars and raucous sounds of previous decades were a spent force. Squeaky clean minimalists with the neat hair and cheerful shirts of off-duty accountants, they wrote nice, pleasant, oddly melancholy tunes for the upwardly mobile generation. No one thought then that Depeche Mode would still be going over a decade later, let alone packing stadiums on a grueling 18-month world tour, that the cherub-faced lead singer Dave Garn would trade his flick fringe for long, unkempt locks, cover himself in leather and tattoos and become a possessed rock and roll wild man, that shy, smiling Martin Gore would evolve into a sequined, guitar-toting near-transvestite. Or, more darkly, that keyboard player Andrew Fletcher would be in the grips of a crippling depression, and that the band's endless partying, Gore's alcohol abuse and Garn's heroin habit in particular would come close to killing them. Martin Gore was born in Dagenham on the 23rd of July 1961. His working-class parents soon moved to nearby Basildon, where the shy, introverted child would lock himself away in his bedroom with his mother's collection of old rock and roll singles. As a teenager, he discovered glam rock and learnt to play acoustic guitar, writing several songs while still at school that would make it onto Depeche Mode's first album. He was a quiet, conscientious student, and after A-levels took a job with the NatWest Bank in London. In his spare time, he was performing in a folk music duo called Norman and the Worms. But Martin's musical career would take a drastic new direction when, in 1979, he bought his first Moog synthesizer. Although Kraftwerk had pioneered electronic music throughout the decade, 1979 was the year that synthesizers stormed the charts. Gary Newman was the first to make an appearance with his breakthrough hit single With Our Friends Electric, and the follow-up Cars, which also went to number 1. This opened the doors for the likes of the Human League and Ultravox, while also inspiring a whole generation of teenagers like Martin Gore to swap guitars for keyboards. Basildon Boys Brigade members Vince Clarke and Andrew Fletcher had also progressed from a love of folk rock, the Eagles, Simon and Garfunkel, to the new synthesizer music. Their first band, No Romance in China, had been formed in 1977, although it bore little relation to the punk sounds of the day. With Clarke on guitar, Fletcher on bass, and a primitive drum machine, they performed Jerry and the Pacemakers and Everly Brothers songs in church halls and youth clubs. Vince Clarke at the time was actually a choir boy, and both were regular churchgoers, shy, studious characters who used music to escape from and overcome their social inhibitions. Clarke had witnessed the show where Gore had introduced the Moog synthesizer to Norman and the Worms set, and the duo convinced Martin to join their new outfit, the catchily named Composition of Sound. Originally featuring bass and guitar, they soon evolved into a completely electronic trio, influenced by Kraftwerk, early Cure, and the new wave of synthesizer groups beginning to crack the charts. At the same time, Gore was playing with another local electronic band called The French Look, and it was at one of their rehearsals that he first met Epping-born 18-year-old Dave Garn. Garn had been singing along to David Bowie's Heroes, and Gore and Vince Clarke immediately spotted a potential singer for Composition of Sound. At the time, Clarke was frontman by default, but it wasn't a role he relished. Garn seemed confident, charismatic, and in tune, and so Clark offered him the job. Dave Garn was something of a tearaway. The man he called Dad had died when he was 7, and 3 years later his mum introduced him to another man who she said was his real father. Garn began getting into trouble and ended up in juvenile court on 3 occasions for vandalism and stealing cars. By the time he was 14, he was a tattooed Southend punk, blagging his way into London nightclubs high on speed and booze. He met his girlfriend Joanne at a 1979 Dan gig, and she introduced him to the music of Gary Newman. Soon, Dave was involved with the post-punk movement that centred on Bowie nights at the London club Billy's, the cult with no name that revolved around dandyism, flamboyance, glamour and electronic dance music. Composition of sound supported the French look at Gore and Fletcher's old school St Nicholas Comprehensive in 1980. This was their first show with Dave on vocals, and Garn brought along 30 or so freaks from Southend, soon to be identified as new romantics, to watch. For the French look, the gig was a disaster as they broke up rather publicly on stage, but for composition of sound, it was a turning point. Garn suggested a new name, one he'd seen on the cover of a French fashion magazine: Depeche Mode.
We just started doing very well, writing our own songs, doing a few covers, and then we got bigger and bigger crowds, and then we made a record. The record went in the charts, and then you think, oh, better make another one, sort of thing. And then we're still working at this time. In fact, it was a bit silly because we was on top of the pops, and we were still working, and so we felt it got to the stage, because we was on an independent label, that we was earning good money, so we gave up our jobs. Then it went on and on and on. Then you get more and more involved, make videos, and then you just realise when you look back, what you have achieved, and you realise you have achieved something creative, and it's, you get a good feeling from it.
On the 16th of August 1980, Depeche Mode began a Saturday night residency at the self-styled synth disco, the Glamour Club, at Crocs in Rayleigh. A fashionable hangout for a mixture of rockabillys, punks and fledgling new romantics, the crowd would often include members of Spandau Ballet and Culture Club, who also played their first gig there. Another Crocs regular was London DJ Steve-O, who was making a name for himself with his extreme electronica sets at Hammersmith's Clarendon Ballroom and his futurist chart in the weekly music paper Sounds. The short-lived futurist scene, which took its name from the revolutionary Italian modern art movement, was a reaction against the empty posturing and overground success of the new romantics, who were perceived as mostly shallow fakers. The futurists were electronic music purists who preferred heavier, darker sounds to the frilly-shirted likes of Duran Duran. When he came across Depeche Mode at Crocs, Steve-O was in the process of putting together a compilation album of futurist bands for his new label, Some Bizarre. He immediately approached Depeche Mode, who had so far encountered nothing but rejection from the London record companies, including hip indie label Rough Trade. An early example of the hard, minimal electronica beloved of the futurists was the 1978 single Warm Leatherette by The Normal, aka 27-year-old krautrock fan Daniel Miller, who had set up his own label Mute for the release. Mute went on to put out dark, unsettling music by Fad Gadget, German outfit DAF, and Miller's own electronic Archies, the Silicon Teens, an imaginary adolescent pop group who released an album of classic rock and roll songs played entirely on synthesizers and a drum machine. Miller had been in the Rough Trade offices the day Depeche Mode brought round their demo tape, but he had dismissed them as scruffy new romantics without hearing the tape. Yet, when Miller saw Depeche Mode supporting Fad Gadget at a gig in Canning Town, he was convinced that he'd found the Silicon Teens made flesh. Unlike most of the synth bands around at the time, Depeche Mode were unpretentious, even naive teenagers, approaching their music not from an art school perspective, but from a simple love of pure pop. Rushing backstage, he signed them to Mute Records on the strength of a handshake. The band didn't have a written contract for several years, and so was still free to record Photographic for Steve-O's Some Bizarre album. Steve-O then agreed to let Depeche Mode go with Mute, while he concentrated on another young futurist band, Soft Cell. The Some Bizarre album, released in February 1981, received widespread media attention as a futurist showcase set, with Depeche Mode being singled out for special praise. Immediately, major record companies tried to lure the band away from Mute with superlative financial offers, but Vince Clarke was determined that they should stay on the tiny indie and maintain control over their affairs. Their debut single, Dreaming of Me, reached number 57 in the charts, a huge success for a small experimental label like Mute, but the single was pure pop. Combining a narcissistic, self-absorbed lyric with a bright, catchy melody and bubblegum backing vocals, Dreaming of Me seemed almost weightless. A tune for singing into the mirror on Friday night, or while idling down the high street on Saturday afternoon, it confirmed Vince Clarke's natural songwriting abilities, while Gore sang in an unthreatening baritone reminiscent of the Human League's Phil Oakey. Reviews and radio play were all positive and helped Daniel Miller make the music business contacts necessary for the marketing and licensing of the follow-up single, New Life. A fizzing, upbeat slice of frothy electropop, New Life reached number 11 in the summer of 1981, and this finally convinced Depeche Mode to give up their day jobs. Martin Gore and Andy Fletcher were still working in banking and insurance, while Dave Garn was studying art at Southend Tech. It was when he was mobbed while on work experience window dressing in central London that Garn realised the band were on their way to becoming pop stars. But Vince Clarke was becoming dissatisfied. The only one who was already committed full-time to the band's career, writing songs, organising dates and mastering the recording studio, he was becoming increasingly isolated from the rest of the group. After their third single, the annoyingly catchy yet brilliant Just Can't Get Enough bounced to number 8 in September 1981, Clarke announced privately that he intended to leave. Depeche Mode were being marketed as a teenage pop fad, and Clarke felt trapped and manipulated. The group and their image were out of his control, the very thing he tried to avoid by remaining on tiny indie Mute. He knew it wouldn't be long before the bubble burst and the industry spat them back out again. In addition, as the main songwriter and musician, he felt the other three were coasting on his talents, enjoying the limelight while he did all the work. After completing the band's debut album, Speak and Spell, and a final UK tour, Vince Clarke left Depeche Mode at the end of 1981. It looked like their 15 minutes in the spotlight were up, but the remaining trio had no intention of giving in so easily.
Looking back, we could have done with Alan really, because he's a very, very good musician, and it's great help to us, because I think we're only really average musicians, and having a really good musician sort of like brings your standards up.
Speak and Spell, named after a popular electronic toy, was a bubblegum dilution of the Futurist Manifesto, and none the worse for it. Combining sparkling dance beats, teen pop melodies, and a distinct, if underlying, melancholic darkness, it reached number 10 in November 1981. The album was well received critically, but there was a patronising edge to the reviews that suggested many felt the band had a built-in obsolescence, a suspicion heightened by the departure of their main songwriter. Depeche Mode showed all the signs of being a flash in the pan, overnight sensations never off the telly or the cover of teenage pop mags like Smash Hits. Their image wasn't helped by their clothes and haircuts, an artless mix of high street fashion and new romantic cast-offs. But a closer listen to the album would reveal that Martin Gore's songs, such as Tora 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 and the instrumental Big Muff, could stand up on their own. A point the remaining Mode trio were keen to make when they went into the studio to record their next single, See You. Although many at the time dismissed it as a sickly imitation of Vince Clarke's effervescent style, See You has a minor chord sadness behind the deceptively naive lyrics, and in fact comes close to being the perfect pop song. A gorgeous hybrid of Kraftwerk and early Beach Boys, particularly when Martin Gore's voice blends with Garn's on the chorus. See You is achingly fragile and lovely, suspended between innocence and knowingness. With another maddeningly simple keyboard riff, the song reached number 6 in February 1982, and the band set out on another sold-out UK tour. Replacing Vince Clarke on stage was a 22-year-old keyboard player named Alan Wilder, a comparatively cosmopolitan middle-class Londoner compared to the gauche working-class Essex trio. Wilder was also an accomplished musician. Initially, however, his appointment was only temporary, and all Wilder was required to do was reproduce Vince Clarke's keyboard parts live, while the remaining 3 members went into the studio without him. Their next single, Meaning of Love, reached a respectable number 12, but was outsold by Vince Clarke's Yazoo, who got to number 2 with Only You, a song originally offered to Depeche Mode but which they turned down. The press were quick to fan the flames of any rivalry, and the situation called for no little diplomacy on the part of Daniel Miller, as both acts were signed to Mute. Depeche Mode's second album, A Broken Frame, was released in September 1982, preceded by the moody, introspective single, Leave in Silence. Very different from the likes of See You, Leave in Silence peaked at number 18, but it was a much more mature, reflective song. While the fans and the media didn't yet know it, Depeche Mode were beginning to leave teen pop behind, and as a consequence, A Broken Frame was an uncertain album, edging cautiously towards the future. Entirely written by Martin Gore, songs like A Photograph of You were pure pop, but they were balanced by Shouldn't Have Done, My Secret Garden, and other downbeat, mysterious numbers evocative of the direction to come.
We write the songs outside the studio. We work on the arrangement outside the studio. When we go into the studio, anything can go, really. Anything goes. We don't have to use just technology. We can use acoustic instruments, which we're doing a lot more recently. And we've got no set rules, basically.
Alan Wilder joined Depeche Mode permanently at the end of 1982, in time to record their next single, Get the Balance Right. It was an apt title. As within a group such as Depeche Mode, who are essentially non-musicians, the balance of personalities is in many ways more important than who does what. For example, while Dave Garn was the singer and Martin Gore the songwriter, Andrew Fletcher's position was less clear. When Vince Clarke left, Fletcher took over many of his non-musical organising roles and also functioned as the notoriously shy and uncommunicative Gore's confidant and right-hand man. But once Alan Wilder was on board, he became the main keyboard player and programmer, and Fletcher stopped actually playing on Depeche Mode's records. Although both men would perform live, Wilder was unquestionably the superior musician. Fletch, however, remained an integral part of the band, albeit one whose contributions were non-musical and hard to define. The A Broken Frame tour took Depeche Mode to America for the 3rd time, where the powerful support of their US label Sire and heavy college radio play had secured them a large following. They then toured the Far East for the first time, an experience that had a profound effect on the band. Still working-class Essex lads barely out of their teens, they'd grown up thinking about nothing much beyond girls, going out and settling down eventually with a nice house and a career. Pop stardom had done little to change this, but their sheltered sensibilities were shocked by the sight of child prostitution, extreme poverty, and open corruption in places like Bangkok. Martin Gore in particular suddenly found himself writing lyrics that looked outwards rather than inwards, and as a result, Depeche Mode's next album, Construction Time Again, would be tagged as their political record. While this wasn't quite accurate, the LP was certainly harder both lyrically and musically than its predecessors. Recorded at ex-Ultravox singer John Fox's garden studios in Shoreditch, it was co-produced by the studio's in-house engineer Gareth Jones, who helped the band make the transition from analog synthesizers to the new digital sampling technology. Uniquely, Depeche Mode have never resorted to using samplers to steal bits of other people's records, or even to recreate the sounds of real instruments. Instead, they invented their own sounds, stretching them out, compressing them and fusing them together, recording the impact of metal on metal in scrapyards and railway yards, and creating melodies from the resulting din. The band were consciously allying themselves with the underground avant-garde movement that would become known as industrial. Pioneered by the cult Some Bizarre band, Throbbing Gristle, who were based close to where Depeche Mode were recording in London's East End, industrial music built up layered collages of abrasive sound into a challenging, concrete whole. Depeche Mode were the first to use such experimental techniques in a melodic pop context, and this mix of classic songwriting, industrial sampling and socially conscious lyrics combined to give them a whole new sound, heralded by the single Everything Counts, which reached number 6 in July 1983. One of Depeche Mode's most enduring songs, Everything Counts crafted metallic noises into danceable rhythms, while the yearning, soulful vocals, aided once again by Gore's wistful harmonies, sang of a world where humanity was losing out to ruthless business tactics. The album also included the rueful Love in Itself and the utopian And Then. While Alan Wilder contributed 2 tracks, The Landscape is Changing and 2-Minute Warning. Pipeline, meanwhile, was the band's most experimental track yet, entirely built up from harsh metallic samples, overlaid into layers of melody. The sleeve of Construction Time Again reflected the album's environmental and social concerns, as well as highlighting their new industrial sound by posing a construction worker in a mountain landscape, a shot reminiscent of classic communist propaganda art. This all found critical favour in an era when left-wing politics dominated the music press, and Construction Time Again reached number 6 in the album charts. But Depeche Mode's time as perceived comrades in the class struggle would be brief, as once again they were about to move on.
I notice in Germany the fans are a lot more varied. There's young and there's more older people as well, and lots of different types of people in Germany. It's a slightly more varied audience here.
Depeche Mode first came to Berlin in 1983, when Daniel Miller and Gareth Jones decided to mix Construction Time Again at the city's Hansa studios. Made famous by David Bowie, who recorded his trilogy of experimental synthesizer albums, Low, Heroes and Lodger there, Hansa was right in the shadow of the Berlin Wall. The austere atmosphere belied a modern, high-tech complex, however, and the band returned to Hansa to record their next album, Some Great Reward. There were several reasons for Depeche Mode decamping to Berlin. It was actually cheaper to record there than in London, and in the mid-80s, British music seemed to be entering a stagnant, reactionary period that was in sharp contrast to Berlin's thriving alternative scene. Fellow Mute artist Nick Cave was also based there, and Depeche Mode themselves were becoming increasingly popular in both East and West Germany. There were also personal reasons for the move. Gareth Jones had fallen in love with a German singer, while Martin Gore had split up with his girlfriend of the last 3 years, and the whole band were impressed by the artistic, creative and sexual freedom the city offered. An isolated city-state in the heart of communist East Germany, Berlin was a magnet for young artists, musicians and those pursuing alternative lifestyles. West Germans could avoid conscription there, and there were generous tax incentives for those wishing to start their own businesses. It was a hothouse of radicalism and experimentalism, 24-hour bars, danger, drugs, eroticism and debauchery. Depeche Mode threw themselves wholeheartedly into the Berlin way of life, but none more so than Martin Gore. The shy, sensitive songwriter had missed out on a lot during his teenage years. But in Berlin, he finally felt like he could go out and play. While the then settled Garn looked on condescendingly, Gore was going out drinking every night, surrounded by a floating circle of girlfriends, experimenting with a creative, hedonistic lifestyle. At the same time, he was immersing himself in European art, films and literature, and exploring his own inner thoughts and desires. He was particularly influenced by his eventual girlfriend, Christina, who introduced him to the S&M fetish scene, and all this was laying the foundations for Depeche Mode's new image. After years of fashion disasters and bad haircuts, the band had finally found a look that suited them. All 4 members began dressing in black leather and wearing eyeliner, but it was Gore who went the furthest. Draped in leather straps, jewellery, chains and crucifixes, sporting lipstick, mascara and black nail varnish, fishnets, biker boots, cowboy hats and exposed flesh, he was a gothic dandy, narcissistically sexual, yet still radiating an innocent, almost feminine charm. Most shocking, perhaps, to Depeche Mode's mainstream fans was his new habit of wearing dresses or leather miniskirts, both on stage and in his private life. While in the studio, he had become prone to stripping off entirely to record his vocal parts. Some, including Dave Garn, might have felt embarrassed at the earnestness with which Martin was exploring his sexuality, particularly as he remained defiantly heterosexual throughout. Yet there's no doubting that the influence of Berlin on the band's look, sound and lyrics helped move them further away from their teen pop image. With Some Great Reward, it was time to take Depeche Mode seriously. Preceded by People Are People, their biggest selling single so far, which reached number 4, the album Some Great Reward continued with the industrial sampling which featured on Construction Time again, while highlighting Martin's lyrics of lust, love, cruelty, sexuality and religious confusion. Master and Servant, another hit single, used sadomasochism as a metaphor for society, while Something to Do hinted at cross-dressing and sexual fetishism. Some Great Reward combined the band's hardest dance rhythms to date with a new depth to their songwriting, and also included tender piano ballads like Somebody. The most controversial track, when released as a single, proved to be Blasphemous Rumours, which took a despairing swipe at a god who allowed bad things to happen. While hardly shocking compared to, say, the works of Marilyn Manson, its questioning of faith was genuine, coming from a band who all had devout religious upbringings. They concluded 1984 with their biggest European tour to date. Depeche Mode were on a roll.
You can understand it. I mean, if you play Bananarama, followed by Tiffany, followed by, I don't know, some real rocking track, and then you play one of our records, you can understand why they don't like, because it doesn't fit in,
In March 1985, Depeche Mode set off on a sold-out American tour, playing arena shows to 2,000 people per night. Steadily building on the cult following generated by continuous college radio support, they had finally broken through in the US. Their moody, introspective sound and accessible take on industrial sampling made them a firm favourite with depressed suburban teenagers, and eventually a pivotal influence on 90s bands like 9 Inch Nails and Front 242. The band were also getting respect from the growing American hip-hop scene, where the 12-inch mixes of their records were being played and sampled alongside current underground electro and rap tunes. Their popularity in Europe, particularly Germany, was also growing, which made it all the more irritating that in Britain Depeche Mode was still perceived as a past their sell-by date teen pop band. The same critics who had swooned over their early singles, citing them as classic disposable pop tunes, now bemoaned the fact that the band was still around and refused to acknowledge that they'd moved on. Yet innocence had given way to experience, and their fans had grown up with them. If still not exactly sophisticated, Depeche Mode now dealt with adult themes of sex, insecurity, alienation, and power. Just how far they'd come was obvious when Mutes released Depeche Mode, the singles 81 to 85. The album reached number 6 in Britain and received a mixed critical reaction. Few, however, could fail to acknowledge Depeche Mode's mastery of the 3-minute pop format and their determination to do something new within its confines. The collection included 2 new tracks, the brooding Shake the Disease and the pacey It's Called a Heart. Neither gave any real indication of the direction Depeche Mode were going to go in next, but the album seemed to draw a line under the first phase of their career, right down the middle of the decade. Their next release, Black Celebration, was recorded in one continuous, and at times tortuous, stretch in London and Berlin. The tensions weren't helped by the increasingly different lifestyles of the band. Dave Gahan had married his girlfriend Joanne and was trying hard to be a responsible adult, while Andy Fletcher had moved in with his partner and a large number of yucca plants. Alan Wilder and Martin Gore, though, were drinking and smoking dope continually through the sessions, which were masterminded once again by Daniel Miller and Gareth Jones. However, the stressful atmosphere was to result in what is, to many, still the classic Depeche Mode album. Claustrophobic, moody, simultaneously anthemic and introspective, Black Celebration was also Depeche Mode's most collaborative effort to date. All 4 members contributed, programming samplers and finding new sounds, while Daniel Miller found himself almost surplus to requirements, as the band had their own strong ideas of the direction the record should take. The album also saw more use of guitars than before, though often heavily treated, distorted, sampled, and overlaid. The first single, Stripped, was based around the sound of a revving motorcycle engine, overlaid with sampled fireworks, car ignition noises, bass and vocals. Lyrically, Gore cited his influences as European writers such as Camus, Kafka and Brecht, although by the time of Black Celebration's release in March 1986, he and Christina had left Berlin for London. Nevertheless, the sexual, existential themes of Some Great Reward persisted, as did the relentless industrial groove. Gore sang on the album's second single, A Question of Lust, which mixed Kurt Weill-style cabaret song with moody electropop. It peaked at number 28, yet the band were now selling out arena shows in Britain, while in America and Germany they were playing in stadiums. Their biggest yet, the 1986 tour, was also the time when Depeche Mode really began to party hard. Martin Gore led from the front, but the supposedly settled and happily married Dave Gahan definitely brought up the rear. Depeche Mode were now a major rock band, and embarking on the lifestyle that went with the territory.
Every single we make a video for, just to promote the single, really.
Following a third single from Black Celebration, A Question of Time, Depeche Mode felt that they'd gone as far as they could in their current direction. The album marked the peak of their experiments in industrial sampling, and now they preferred to move on rather than risk repeating themselves. Daniel Miller, who had co-produced all their albums so far, had seen on Black Celebration that his boys were now more than capable of looking after themselves, and so took a back seat to concentrate on his business as a record company boss. They also decided not to use Gareth Jones on the new sessions, and instead hired Tears for Fears producer Dave Bascombe. His brief was simple: to go for a warmer, more organic feel, even embracing traditional rock structures, while still maintaining the Depeche Mode sound. The band continued to sample sounds from the city they recorded in this case Paris, but they also jammed together on guitars and live drums in order to work in a more natural, spontaneous fashion. The resulting album, Music for the Masses, also saw Alan Wilder exerting more influence than ever before, painstakingly programming, mixing and layering the sounds and beats until they were absolutely perfect. This latest release was preceded by a single, Strangelove, in April 1987. A bridge between the sound of Black Celebration and the new release, the band were reportedly unhappy with the mix of this brooding hymn to sexual experimentation, re-recording it for the final album version. The video was shot by the noted Dutch photographer Anton Corbijn, who'd also directed the promo for A Question of Time. Black and white, moody and artistic, Corbyn's videos would be largely responsible for creating Depeche Mode's new, mature image as they moved away from leather fetishism and metal bashing. They were now a serious, modern, electronic rock band, equally at home in the stadium concert or on the dance floor. The title of Music for the Masses, while supposedly an ironic reference to their eternal cult appeal, was in fact an appropriate name for an album of anthemic, knowing numbers that effortlessly steamrolled the listener into grateful submission. The LP's second single, Never Let Me Down Again, was a case in point, with its sweeping orchestral groove and Led Zeppelin-inspired drum sound. It was the closest they'd come to a rock song, yet it remained streamlined and without an inch of excess flab. The album also featured the reptilian driving song Behind the Wheel, the powerful, haunting Little 15, and the Wagnerian instrumental Pimpf. The accompanying live shows had an appropriately totalitarian feel, with stage sets designed like a Roman amphitheatre, draped with huge flags bearing ominous, ambiguous symbols. Huge orange megaphones blared out at the crowd from the top of the speaker stacks as the band toured arenas and stadiums in Europe and America, playing 101 concerts between the 22nd of October 1987 and the 18th of June 1988. For the final American leg of the tour, the band hired legendary filmmaker D.A. Pennebaker, most famous for his 1967 Bob Dylan documentary Don't Look Back, to capture the spectacle in the musical road movie 101. Pennebaker wasn't a fan of Depeche Mode's music, yet he understood the impact they had on their fans, the power of their live show, and the unsettling experience of an English band on a huge American tour, cocooned in a bubble of drink, drugs, boredom, adulation, and routine. The film contained moments of deadpan, Spinal Tap-like hilarity, as well as showing the financial realities behind the glamour. It was appropriate then that a live version of Everything Counts should be released as a single from the soundtrack album in February 1989. The film showed Depeche Mode taking on America with everything they had, hungry for the prize, taking a gamble and winning. But the tour also saw the levels of rock and roll excess increasing, with Dave Gahan beginning to seriously slip off the wagon. While still trying to pretend that his marriage was working out, the singer gave in to temptation every night, whether to the endless supply of willing groupies or to cocaine. Always slightly out of place in front of the huge, oppressive stage sets, wiggling his bum in his tight white jeans and cut-off jacket, Gahan was beginning to worry that he wasn't living up to the band's image. Maybe, he thought, it was time to start acting like a real live rock star should. There aren't any more rock and roll people anymore, Gahan said in 1988. People that do it because they really believe in it. Dave Gahan was about to take it upon himself to fill that gap with devastating consequences.
In fact, what's quite exciting in England at the moment is all this house music, which is really popular, and that It comes straight from what we've been doing really in the last 7 or 8. In fact, journalists are shocked when they ask all these bands who they like and who they listen to, and they say us and say, what? You know.
Dave Bascombe was unavailable to work on the band's next album, Violator, and so Depeche Mode contacted Mark Flood Ellis, an engineer and producer long associated with Mute Records and a Depeche Mode fan of long standing. When he was finally able to work with the group, they clicked immediately. Flood and Alan Wilder in particular forming a close working relationship in the studio. In contrast to previous albums, when Martin Gore would arrive with a set of nearly complete demos, the songs on Violator were allowed to develop organically, often starting with basic guitar tracks. In effect, Depeche Mode were coming around to a traditional rock and roll way of making music, having previously been manipulators of sound in the studio, the reverse of the path most bands follow. They allowed themselves to experiment with different sounds and techniques, jamming together as on Music for the Masses, but going one step further towards a looser, more relaxed and spontaneous way of working. This may have been influenced by the fact that Milan, where the album was partly recorded, had a dynamic club culture which the band took full advantage of. Violator was recorded on the cusp of the decade, at the point where the 80s acid house boom was just beginning to go mainstream, mutating into the musical force that would dominate the 1990s techno. Many house and techno DJs and musicians saw Depeche Mode as a pivotal influence, although the band themselves were ambivalent about their role. They saw themselves as songwriters who made forward-looking electronic music that happened to be danceable, but they were not in the business of churning out anonymous dance records. Ironically, just as techno was exploding, with major players like Derek May bigging up the Depeche Mode back catalogue, the band were moving more towards guitars, traditional structures and a slower, almost bluesy feel typified by tracks like Personal Jesus. Gore was returning to his glam rock roots, while Dave Gahan grew his hair in an attempt to be taken more seriously as a frontman. Violator opens with the chilling World in My Eyes, before the seductive, cinematic Sweetest Perfection allows a shaft of light to penetrate the gloom. Halo and Policy of Truth make for stomping electro-funk, while Enjoy the Silence most showed the influence of the club scene and the propulsive rush of ecstasy. The album was finished off in Denmark, and it was here that Andy Fletcher began to show the first signs of a crippling hypochondriac depression. Often seen as the solid, stable median between the twin poles of Dave Gahan and Martin Gore, Fletcher's bluff Essex attitude concealed a sensitive and highly strung individual. 5 years previously, Fletcher's sister had died of stomach cancer while still in her mid-20s, and the pressure of being in a globally successful band had not allowed him the time or space to grieve properly. Finally, all the pent-up emotion began to manifest itself in anxiety attacks and imaginary illnesses, complete with very real, if psychosomatic, physical pain. He was prescribed medication, but the drugs only disguised the problem, making him even more hyperactive, nervous and irritable than usual, and heightening the growing tension between him and Alan Wilder. Wilder had never fully appreciated Fletcher's abstract role in the band, and increasingly saw the studio as his own private domain. He resented what he saw as Fletcher's unnecessary and ill-informed interjections. At the same time, Dave Gahan's marriage was beginning to disintegrate, and he had embarked on an affair with the band's American publicist, Teresa Conway. It was in this vulnerable state that the band set out on another riotous, ecstasy-fueled world tour. The Anton Corbijn designed stage set was at once both awe-inspiring and emotionally intimate, incorporating giant screens which heightened Violator's cinematic feel. Depeche Mode sold out a 31-date stadium tour of America within hours of tickets going on sale. The hedonism too reached an unprecedented scale, with Gahan and his new partner Teresa Conway now wholeheartedly indulging in cocaine and ecstasy-inspired debauchery. Gore's legendary drinking also continued unabated, while Fletcher's fragile mental state and the conflict between him and Alan Wilder bubbled just below the surface. Every night was a party, and the band convinced themselves that they were still having fun. But something had to give.
It's not a cool thing to be an addict. It's not, you're a slave to it, and it's taking everything away from me that I love.
In 1991, Martin and Andy both found themselves with newborn daughters, Viva and Megan respectively, and the band took some much-needed time off to recuperate. Alan Wilder pursued his solo career as Recoil, and along with Flood co-produced Nitzer Ebb's Ebbhead LP. Garn, meanwhile, had finally left his wife and son and moved to Los Angeles with Teresa Conway, where his transformation into a cliched rock star continued apace. The couple were both using heroin, and the long-haired, goateed, grunge-obsessed Garn had begun to cover himself with brutally macho tattoos. Teresa, too, had changed from a vivacious California blonde to a dark-haired gothette, and both appeared pale and gaunt when they were married, with obligatory Elvis impersonator at a Las Vegas chapel in 1992. Garn's father had died in 1991, and he seemed to be reliving the emotional trauma of never knowing his real dad that had triggered his wild behaviour in his teens. The difference was that now Garn had a lot more space and money to get himself into trouble. While genuinely in love with the equally screwed up Teresa, he was also torturing himself with guilt over leaving his wife and son in the same way that his own father had deserted him. His swaggering bravado and determination to act like a real rock star masked a self-destructive streak, and his heroin use soon spiraled into a cycle of shame and addiction. In 1993, he admitted that he had created a monster, thinking that, in order to go out in front of thousands of people, singing songs about darkness, lust, passion and pain, he had to live the lifestyle as well. He was taking himself to hell, pushing himself to physical and emotional extremes in order to test himself and prove that he meant it. Sometimes it looked like he wanted to live the part. At others, it seemed like he was ready to die for it. Depeche Mode regrouped in 1992 to begin work on their next album, Songs of Faith and Devotion, in a villa in Spain. Flood had suggested the band all live and work together continuously through the recording sessions with no distractions. It was then that the band realised just how much their frontman had changed. Inevitably, personalities clashed, and the atmosphere was extremely tense and claustrophobic. Garn shut himself away in his room, creating his own environment full of candles, drapes, scarves and incense, in which he would sit and paint or strum at his guitar. Martin Gore responded by getting drunk throughout the sessions, while Fletch hung around getting on the nerves of Alan Wilder, who took on most of the workload. The album reflected this environment, but despite disagreements among the band on the direction it should take, Songs of Faith and Devotion remains one of Depeche Mode's finest records. From the squealing electro-pulse of I Feel You to the chemical high of Rush, via the gospel-tinged Walking in My Shoes, Condemnation and Get Right With Me, it reflected the very different personalities involved. Gore, while trying to move on from the organic feel of Violator, was still writing quite precise European pop songs, while Garn was determined to push things in a more Americanized, grungier direction. His vocals were rawer and more emotive than ever, while Wilder and Flood gave the whole album a swirling, anthemic sheen. An exhausted Fletcher actually sat out the last stages of the recording process, but the struggle was worth it. The album topped the charts in both Britain and America and was their most well-received yet. There was only one problem. This rapidly disintegrating band now had to take it on tour.
it'd be a shame to stop. You know, when you know, and we still regard ourselves as being young.
The Devotional Tour was Depeche Mode's biggest yet, but the band members were determined to keep their distance from each other as much as possible. Travelling in separate limousines, staying on separate floors of their hotels with their own private dressing rooms. The only time they were together was on stage. Gore cut himself off from the others, bringing his rock and roll bubble of scarves, incense, candles and drugs everywhere he went. Backstage, he had his own inner sanctum, surrounded by hardcore party people and groupies, encouraging and indulging his every desire. The party followed Gore around, continuing as long as he was still able to stand, and by this point, Depeche Mode's entourage was huge. They employed a crew of 120 people on the road, including a drug dealer and a psychiatrist. Everyone was involved in an epic, endless, 18-month-long party. The rest of the band had confronted Dave about his heroin problems, and he had made vague promises to clean up his act. But it was hard for any of them to point the finger. Gore and Wilder were both drinking heavily, while Fletch had too many problems of his own to try to deal with Gore as well. In no mood to party, he became increasingly isolated on the tour, developing an obsessive-compulsive disorder that resulted in him becoming convinced that he had a brain tumour. He wasn't exactly easy to be around, and as the hedonism became more and more desperate, no one relished having Fletch spoil the mood. Alan Wilder particularly resented his inability to function, and the band barely tolerated each other on stage. Fletch finally succumbed to another breakdown and left the tour in March 1994, checking himself into a hospital. Gore pointed out that he never let his habit get in the way of the show and always turned up on time, giving 100%. In addition, while the rest of the band simply stood at the back of Anton Corbijn's impressive austere set, Gore was in the physically demanding position of having to communicate to vast audiences, in danger of being overwhelmed by the screens and spectacle around him. Gore may have played some guitar, and Wilder had a go on drums, but Gore, who had prepared for the tour with rigorous exercise workouts and by having a 10-hour session to put a winged tattoo on his back, was pushing himself to the limit. Many felt that his larger-than-life rock god persona came too close to self-parody, and occasionally Gore would misjudge his capabilities, such as the night he threw himself into the audience at a show in Germany and was almost torn limb from limb. The pressures were such that he actually had a minor heart attack after coming off stage in New Orleans. Martin Gore, meanwhile, had a seizure in Los Angeles, while in South Africa, Alan Wilder was rushed to hospital with kidney stones, both side effects of incessant alcohol abuse. On the 31st of July 1993, the band played to 30,000 people at Crystal Palace Bowl, and in December they released a live version of Songs of Faith and Devotion with an accompanying video before returning to their world tour. On the final leg in America, Dave Gore handpicked Primal Scream as the support band, largely because they were known to be party animals. By this stage, the performances were beginning to suffer, and on the very last show in Indianapolis on the 8th of July 1994, Gore dived off the stage and onto the crash barriers, breaking 2 ribs and hemorrhaging internally. He was rushed to hospital, but discharged himself to recuperate with Teresa in an isolated cabin in Northern California. The come down was brutal. Without the routine and adrenaline of being on tour, Dave was physically, mentally and emotionally drained, and he was now addicted to heroin. He found that he no longer got high from using the drug, but had to take it simply in order to function. Once back in Los Angeles, he compensated by going on month-long binges, followed by remorseful attempts to clean up his act. Teresa was also a junkie, and the pair inevitably relapsed. In 1995, after overdosing in front of his mother and his 8-year-old son, Gore was in and out of rehab, lying both to himself and others. The endless contradictions and deceptions eventually led to Teresa walking out, and left on his own, he became increasingly vulnerable to the dealers, users and hangers-on that circled him like vultures. The final straw came in August 1995, when Garn returned from rehab to find he'd been burgled and had lost everything. Feeling isolated and worthless, he phoned his mother from a hotel room, telling her he was clean, but she refused to believe him. He walked away from the telephone, shot up, drank a bottle of wine, took several Valium and slashed his wrists, wrapping warm towels around them. Returning to the phone, he told his mum he loved her, then collapsed. When he woke up, he found his wrists were being stitched up by paramedics without an anaesthetic, as there was no time to get him to hospital. The next thing he knew, he was straitjacketed and locked in a padded cell. Despite all this, once he was released from medical care, he went straight back to injecting heroin. It seemed like Garn's days on this planet were numbered.
The only thing he had left in the world was the band, and he got his act together. He went into rehab, he got himself a vocal coach, and came and done great vocals.
In June 1995, Alan Wilder announced that he was leaving Depeche Mode. It was probably inevitable that the four men who came back from the Devotional tour would not work together again. Yet Wilder's decision could not have come at a worse time. With Garn incapacitated, many thought this was the end for the band. Wilder himself said that he felt his contributions had been consistently undervalued and unappreciated, and he was unwilling to put himself through the stress of recording another Depeche Mode album. Gore and Fletcher, however, were determined to carry on. In late 1995, the pair began tentative sessions with hip-hop producer Tim Simonon of Bomb the Bass fame in a small, cheap studio in London. Simonon brought his own recording team with him, comprising of engineer Q, programmer Kerry Hopwood, and keyboard player Dave Clayton, who collectively stepped into the shoes of the departed Wilder. Martin Gore, too, worked harder than ever, and the initial sessions soon produced 6 songs that would end up on the Ultra album, including the single Barrel of a Gun. They then joined up with Dave Garn in New York so that he could record his vocal parts. But initial results were disastrous. Garn was either high or in withdrawal and was incapable of even standing up for more than an hour at a time. Only one successful vocal was completed, and that was pieced together from different takes. Sister of Night survives on Ultra as a fragile, harrowing performance. The frustration of being unable to express himself led to Garn returning to LA and going on another self-destructive drugs binge, shooting up heroin and cocaine speedballs in his Sunset Strip hotel room. He was using a notorious brand of heroin known as Red Rum, which Garn thought referred to the racehorse, but which of course spells murder backwards. On the morning of the 28th of May 1996, he overdosed after injecting a speedball, suffered a cardiac arrest and actually died for several minutes. Luckily, he wasn't alone, and a girlfriend was able to call 911. Paramedics revived Garn on the way to hospital, and on being discharged the next morning, he was arrested for possession of controlled substances. The singer made a rambling press statement outside the LA County Sheriff's office, but when he was released on bail, he went straight back to shooting up. Finally, Garn's American record company intervened, insisting that he check into the Exodus Recovery Center immediately. Here, he finally realized just how close he was to losing everything. Strapped down as he underwent hourly seizures from cold turkey, Garn was watched around the clock in conditions closer to a low-security prison than a clinic. The choice was stark. If Garn went back to drugs, he would probably die. He would certainly go to jail, and that would mean the end of Depeche Mode. Even if released, he would be unable to tour with a criminal record. But thankfully, he pulled himself together. On being discharged from Exodus, he was put on probation and went into a halfway house before rejoining the band in London. Determined to put his life back together and create something positive, Dave worked hard on his vocals with longtime associate Gareth Jones, while also attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. Ultra was finally completed in late 1996.
Every kid in England wants to be in a band, don't they, from an early age, you know. I don't know why, but they just do, don't they?
Barrel of a Gun was released as a single in February 1997, going straight to number 4 in the charts. One of the hardest, edgiest tracks the band had recorded. It combined the minimal electronica of their roots with a modern techno feel. The album, Ultra, similarly managed to fuse all of Depeche Mode's influences into a striking, coherent whole, summing up the past, present and future of the band. Daniel Miller played on Uselink, while one of his krautrock heroes, Can's Jackie Lieberzeit, also made a guest appearance. The bottom line was a country-tinged groove featuring BJ Cole on steel guitar, while elsewhere soulful ballads like Home and The Love Thieves mixed with trip-hop influenced tracks like It's No Good. The record as a whole saw the band slowing down, mining a moody R&B vein, a combination of Marvin Gaye, Massive Attack and the steady pulse of early 80s futurism. The fans responded by sending Ultra to number 1 across the globe. Ultra was followed in 1998 by the singles 1986 to 98, including 3 new tracks, Only When I Lose Myself, Surrender and Head Star, recorded once again with Tim Simonon. Simonon also went out as a DJ when the band decided to promote the collection with a tour, an event approached with some trepidation. However, with a scaled-down stage set from Anton Corbijn and a rigorous no-drink, no-drugs policy, Depeche Mode played all their hits to a rapturous reception over 4 months in late 1998. It signalled the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. From perfect throwaway pop to dirty electronic rock, Depeche Mode had survived where few expected them to, forging their own unique sound into the process. Now, stripped down and cleaned up, they were back on form and ready to begin a new chapter, a new life indeed.
Thank you for buying Maximum Depeche Mode. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. If you did enjoy or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, Surrey, UK, KT36YY, or email on mail@chromedreams.co.uk. Details of our full catalogue are listed on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk. Thanks again for listening and goodbye for now.